Hello, my name's David Wood. Thanks for joining me today for this program called For Parents in Recovery, Staying Sober After Losing a Child. It's been 3 years since our son Galen's death from chronic illness. They've been the worst of my life. We saw his end coming, but we couldn't prepare for it or imagine what it would be like. When it happened, it felt just as sudden and shocking as if he'd drowned or been hit by a car. His death anniversary marks the day everything changed forever, the moment that has divided our lives into two halves, before he died and after he died. The death of a child is uniquely tragic because it's out of order. Our kids just aren't supposed to die before we do. When we look at them, we see our hopes of graduations, weddings, grandchildren, and the hope that on our deathbeds, their faces will be the last things we see on this earth. When we lose our kids, all these hopes disappear forever. I've been sober for 25 years. After our son's death, I was dismayed to find that the 12-step model of recovery that had saved my life all those years before offered me very little help in coping with the loss of my child. I've given a lot of thought to why this is, and I'd like to share some of those thoughts with you today. The 12-step model teaches us that recovery comes from doing the work. Like any behavior modification program, the idea is that if we perform certain actions over and over, our thinking will change. The promises, and right now I'm referring to a passage from the 1939 publication called Alcoholics Anonymous, tells us what lies in store if we do the work the 12 steps require. That text assures us, indeed it promises us, that if we're painstaking in our efforts, we will come to know a new freedom and a new happiness. All our fears will leave us, and we will find serenity and peace. When our son died, folks in the 12-step program I attend at first embraced me and comforted me. But in the months that followed, it became increasingly obvious that many of them felt uncomfortable in my presence. They seemed puzzled, then frustrated by what they saw as my failure to do what I knew would pull me out of my tailspin: work the steps. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. I mean, after all, we were taught that working the steps was the cure for every crisis. It's 12-step orthodoxy that if there's a disturbance in our lives, great or small, it's because we haven't worked the steps right, or our faith in our higher power isn't strong enough, or we're wallowing in addictive self-pity. In other words, if we're still suffering beyond a certain interval, we have no one to blame but ourselves. So I want to talk today to parents who have the disease of addiction like I do, whose children have died, and who are trying to get or stay sober. At times, I'll use the term getting sober as shorthand for getting into recovery, but I'm not just talking about addiction to alcohol. For some people it's booze, but for others it's sex or drugs, food or gambling, but it's all the same illness. You'll hear me use today a lot of AA terms and concepts. That's because Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, who pioneered the 12-step model of recovery back in 1935, also pioneered the vocabulary we still use today to talk about addiction 85 years later. Just because I use this vocabulary doesn't mean I'm here representing AA or any other program or organization. I'm definitely not a spokesman for anybody or anything. I'm a free agent, just a guy in recovery trying to stay that way after losing a child. Until Bill's time, addiction, and addiction to alcohol in particular, was regarded as an incurable, untreatable, and almost always fatal condition. The 12-step model offered a remission from this illness, contingent upon keeping ourselves spiritually fit. Bill's work ranks as one of the greatest public health breakthroughs of our time, and it saved countless lives. Yet this program of recovery, this miraculous solution to the alcoholic problem, later adapted to so many other forms of addiction, it ultimately failed me after Galen died, right when I needed it the most. I want to share with you today about how I stayed sober after losing my son. I'm going to talk about the promises and why they sound so hollow to someone in recovery whose child has died. At the end of our time together, I'm going to leave you with a new set of promises that are more realistic and more relevant. Promises designed just for us, parents trying to get or stay sober after the deaths of our children. On February 18, 2017, I was sitting in a meeting of my home group in Southern California where I live. My phone vibrated, and I saw it was my wife calling. That was really unusual. She knew where I was and what I was doing at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and I knew she'd never call me then unless something was very, very wrong. I stepped outside and answered. Her voice choked with sobs. She told me she had found our son Galen dead, and our lives changed forever. I don't remember much about what happened in the hours that followed. I remember calling my sponsor, Bob, and hearing his quiet, kind voice say in his deep Oklahoma drawl, "It was his time, David. It was his time." That evening, I slipped off to a candlelight meeting I hadn't attended in years, hoping to sit quietly in the back and try to pull myself together. But the secretary asked me to lead, so I ended up telling my son's story in all its tragic detail, seeing the shock on the faces of the people in the room as they thought of their own children and wept. I couldn't have known then that this marked the beginning of the greatest challenge to my recovery I've ever faced in my many years of sobriety. For a long time, drinking was fun, until it wasn't. I won't bore you with my drunk-a-log, but suffice it to say that bad things happened. I neglected my family. I nearly wrecked my marriage. I hit bottom hard. Then I was blessed with a moment of clarity, and I got to start my life all over again. I did everything that was suggested. I got a sponsor. I went to meetings. I worked the steps. I carried the message. I was a poster child for the 12-step model of recovery. I found a higher power. I got the daily reprieve. The promises all came true for me. Then our son died, and it was as if a switch deep inside me was thrown, and I suddenly lost all contact with my higher power. That contact has never returned. After a few months passed, and the relentless, grinding grief wore on, I began to notice that friends in the program who had swarmed me at first were beginning to pull back. I could see them thinking, if he's still feeling bad after all this time, he must be just feeling sorry for himself, right? And I could hear them conclude, he knows he can just pull out of this by working the steps, so why isn't he doing it? I had seen this happen to people with clinical depression who didn't respond fully to the program, no matter how hard they tried. As they relapsed, came back, relapsed again, and sometimes died, I had heard people blame them for not working the program hard enough. What other explanation could there be, they seemed to say. After all, if you do the work, the promises always materialize, right? It turns out this isn't right, because some people need more help than others. As a fellowship, we do a poor job of helping alcoholics and addicts who also suffer from organic mental illness. For people with co-occurring disorders, working the steps isn't always enough. Bill Wilson was one of these people. He suffered terribly from long bouts of depression. Had he lived today, a good psychiatrist would have put him on one of the medications we have now to treat major depression. This would have saved Bill so much misery. I sometimes hear of newcomers being told they aren't clean and sober if they take these meds. That's just cruel and it's inappropriate. Choices about what meds to take or not to take are between a doctor and a patient, and nobody in the program has any business interfering with that relationship. More fundamentally, though, it's unkind to make a newcomer think he has to choose between the relief these medications bring and the relief recovery brings. It's equally unkind to tell a parent suffering through the death of a child that there's a time limit on grief, and that if it continues past its expiration date, the sufferer must just be feeling sorry for himself. Ironically, we have Bill to thank for this kind of thinking. Bill believed that his periods of often crippling depression were triggered by the deep remorse he felt for his serial infidelities to his wife Lois that led to a loss of what he called emotional sobriety. Bill considered working the steps and the spiritual awakening that was bound to happen by doing so as the only antidote to depression. When the antidote didn't work and the depression still came on, he attributed this to his not working his program hard enough. So it's no wonder that people who get sober under the 12-step banner get the strong message that, one, if we have disturbing feelings, great or small, it's because we aren't doing the work the 12-step model requires. And two, if we buckle down and do this work, those feelings will go away, the promises will always materialize, and we'll be happy, joyous, and free. Parents in recovery who've lost a child know it just doesn't work this way. After Galen died, people said a lot of things to me that were unintentionally hurtful. They told me he's in a better place now, and God must have had another plan for him. You know, I get that they were just trying to help, but what they were saying was that if I only believed the way they believed, my pain would go away. That didn't help at all. I don't believe my boy is in a better place, or that God has another plan for him. The best place for Galen is right here in my arms. And I just don't believe there's a God that plans the deaths of children. One fellow who knew we had adopted our son said to me, "At least he wasn't your natural child." That was really hard to hear. Our boy was born in our hearts, and we fell in love with him the moment he came into our lives. That anybody might think we loved him less because he was adopted, it was just incomprehensible to me. I still tear up thinking about it. But you know what cut me more deeply than anything else? It was the people who seemed irritated that I wasn't cheering up already and asked me, "Can't you just make it a good day?" Really? I felt like saying. I can just turn off the anguish, make it stop just by making it a good day? And what if I don't or can't? Does that mean that all this pain is my fault? Only in retrospect can I see how huge the disconnect was between my experience and that of these people. They assumed 6 months after my son's death that this was plenty long enough to grieve the loss of a child and that I should be over it by now. But at 6 months, I was still in shock. I was still being overwhelmed by waves of grief on a daily basis. So I'm a lawyer, and right around 6 months after our son died, I was in court in a southern state in the middle of arguing a case when the judge suspended the hearing to finalize an adoption. Now, judges love doing that. It's a welcome break from contentious lawsuits. They don't have to make any decisions. And for 10 or 15 minutes, their courtrooms are filled with happy people and good feelings. The days my wife and I appeared in California courts with our sons to finalize their adoptions are among the fondest memories of my life. That day, a large extended family trooped into the courtroom, the mom proudly holding a little boy. The judge asked Mom and Dad to raise their right hands and to swear to love him, to teach him to be a good person and to protect him from harm. They solemnly took that oath. Then all the relatives cheered, and all the lawyers in the courtroom joined in. Except me. I burst into tears, recalling the same oath I had taken to protect my little Galen that I had been unable to keep. The family left, and the court went back to hearing my case. As I stepped back to the podium, tears streaming down my face, I had to tell the judge, on the record, in front of a room full of lawyers, that I had recently lost my adopted child and needed a moment to compose myself. He was very kind, but it was terribly awkward, and I felt deeply frustrated at being unable to control my emotions while doing my job. But that's how it was for me at 6 months. The folks who thought that by then I ought to be able to just get over it and make it a good day, they just had no way of comprehending what I was going through. I'll admit this hurt. The program had been the last house on the block for me. My life had been saved because the other tenants in that house had moved over and welcomed me in. Now it felt like I was being evicted because I couldn't just switch off my grief. That wasn't the way the 12-step model was supposed to work. We're supposed to be a fellowship of men and women who share our experience, strength, and hope with each other, that we may solve our common problem and help others to recover from the disease of addiction. The power of one alcoholic sharing with another alcoholic what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now, well, that's what got me sober in the first place. I've witnessed this power work miracles time and time again. When we immerse ourselves in the program and keep coming back long enough, we get to see miracles like this happen all the time. But when our son died, this power of the fellowship that I had seen help people come from the worst situations reclaim their lives, it just went away from me. Thankfully, when we lost Galen, I didn't want to drink or commit suicide, but I sure did want to escape. I wanted to sell the house and move away. I wanted to just not answer the phone or get out of bed. I just wanted to turn out the lights. That felt all too familiar because drinking had been all about escape for me, as it is for most of us. I'd come home from work, go straight to the fridge for the first beer, and say to myself, hey, I work hard. I put a roof over this family's head and food on the table. Don't I get to just turn off the lights for a while and take a break? Well, that, of course, was code for getting drunk every night, which I did for many years. Normal people don't do that. They don't drink or use on a daily basis to numb their feelings. They seem to understand intuitively that turning out the lights only makes the stress and pain worse. I've learned in recovery that I had been acting like a totally selfish brat, thinking I had a God-given right to drink myself stupid on a daily basis. Because guess what? The lights are always on. Grown-ups don't get to escape, even if, and perhaps especially if, what we're going through is incredibly painful. But what does the 12-step model offer parents who have lost their child and who struggle with the craving for a drink or a drug? I want to talk for a minute just to the parents who have lost a child and are not sober, but want to be. You're the most important people in the room. You may be drinking or using right now, or you may be struggling against the craving or feeling it coming on. Anybody who's gotten sober knows exactly what that feels like. And all of us know what a dangerous place that is. So I want to be very, very direct with you. Overcoming addiction is hard. It takes enormous courage. It takes going toe-to-toe with a progressive and fatal disease that's killed and driven crazy better men than me. Getting sober is not for the weak, and it's not for the lazy. If you're struggling against this disease, trying to put some time together, you're in the right place. Even if you haven't gotten it yet, you're already showing the courage it takes to achieve recovery. After all, you're here, right? You could be out drinking somewhere, trying to douse the pain of losing your child. The very fact that you're here with us, struggling against this deadly disease, watching this program, means that you want what we have. I'm so glad. So are you willing to go to any lengths to get it? Can you find in yourself the strength to keep trying after the death of your child? To keep coming back to meetings and to find those of us who are walking the same path as you are? I sure hope the answer is yes, because you don't have to do this alone. Just by suiting up and showing up for this program here today, you've taken that first step back from the edge of the abyss. You know, the progress of the disease of addiction is like a long walk into a deep, dark forest. The longer our drinking went on, the farther we walked into its depths, and the darker and scarier it got. When we made the decision to change our lives, we turned around and began walking back out. And the instant we made that pivot and took that first step, we abandoned our old lives and started new ones. Walking back out took a long time, but all we had to do to begin that journey was to make that about face and take that first step. I don't mean to make any of that sound easy. It isn't. It's very, very hard. And it's so much harder when you're walking through the worst days of your life after the death of your son or daughter. I'm going to come back to you at the end of this talk with some concrete suggestions about how to get back into recovery. If you're anything like I was, your problem after losing your child isn't how to get through the next 24 hours. It's how to get through the next 5 minutes. I get it. Please stay. You're right where you're supposed to be. After our son died and my conscious contact with a higher power switched off, it became very hard for me to keep going to meetings, my home group in particular. It felt like I had 3 options. I could stop attending my home group and find other meetings where I have no history, or I could attend my home group, sit in the back, and simply stop sharing about my experience, or I could stop going to meetings altogether. I didn't like any of these choices. The first option, attending different meetings, didn't seem very workable to me. I could go find folks who didn't know me and share my grief with them, but I'd just be doing it geographic, expecting a different response from people with the same orientation. Wouldn't some of them, too, eventually start thinking, after maybe 6 months or so, that it was about time I snapped out of it and worked the steps harder? Then I'd be back to square one. That didn't sound like a great strategy for keeping my recovery long term. The second option, going to my regular meetings, but arriving late, sitting in the back, leaving early, didn't seem like a whole lot better. I loved my home group. The people there had become my family. How could I simply clam up and not participate? Those of us with some time under our belts, we have a responsibility to tell our stories so newcomers hear the similarities with their own. We've got to talk openly about working the steps. We must be good sponsors. We're trustees of this precious gift of recovery we've been given, and we have to give it away to keep it. If I went to my regular meetings but didn't participate, I'd be shirking these responsibilities. So I had to cross that one off the list too. That left the third option, not going to meetings at all. That was out of the question. After 25 years, I probably could stay sober without attending meetings, but why on earth would I risk that? I had found the secret sauce, what Bill Wilson always called the keys to the kingdom. Walking away from the fellowship entirely, that'd be like playing Russian roulette. Sooner or later, My luck might run out and I'd get my head blown off. Why would I gamble with my life like that? Well, the bottom line is I couldn't. So I had to come up with a fourth option, and that turned out to be the one that was hardest to execute. I made myself go back to my regular meetings and be a responsible contributing member. I tried to ignore those who seemed so uncomfortable in my presence, and I reclaimed my seat in the rooms. And you know what? I had a new moment of clarity. I realized I had to feel compassion for those around me who were so distressed by witnessing my grief. I saw that someday tragedy was going to happen to them too. It's just a part of life. I realized I had to be there for them when that happened, ready to listen, ready to help. Because we do this recovery thing on the buddy system. I had to get over my disappointment about the 12-step model not serving bereaved parents very well. I had to practice forgiveness. When I dragged myself into the room, I was willing to do anything to get sober, including finding God like the second step requires. I had never believed in any kind of deity or divine being, but I was so broken and desperate, I would have believed in the Easter Bunny if that's what you told me I needed to do to get sober. Having no concept of what God looked like, I borrowed the one that those around me seemed to prefer. An old white guy in a robe with a long beard who told me what to do to make my life go right. And you know, for a while, that God worked for me. But as the smoke cleared and the years passed, my concept of a higher power gradually changed. I no longer experienced God as a source of advice and direction, but I did find that if I kept my heart open, I seemed to be able to tap into a source of inspiration I couldn't explain. It wasn't supernatural, really. It was more like a warm wind at my back, guiding me ever so gently in the right direction. I had a conscious contact with this God that was subtle and hard to describe, but it worked. I felt that God, as I understood God, was at work in my life. This warm wind just went away when our son died. I groped for it, I prayed for it, but it just wasn't there anymore. Today, I have no experience of God, at least not in the way I had before. All I know is that whoever or whatever is running the show, it ain't me. I like travel metaphors because I spent a lot of time on planes. When I board an airplane, the crew are my higher power, and I surrender my life and my will over to their care for the duration of the flight. Their only concern is to get me safely from point A to point B. I don't know them or have personal relationships with them. They might be really great people, or they might be serial killers. I'm never going to know. But I don't have to know who or what I'm surrendering to for the act of surrender to be powerful. Just because I never meet the pilot doesn't mean I can't turn my life and my will over to his or her care. If we hit turbulence during the flight, I don't muscle my way into the cockpit and take over. You do not want me flying the plane. I'm not responsible for our flight plan, how much fuel we have, or whether we fly through or around that thunderstorm. What I am responsible for is sitting back, letting the crew do their jobs without any interference from me. This simple act of surrender keeps me right-sized and in my lane. Now, when I feel blamed for not just shaking off the grief, I try to simply surrender, admitting I can't control what people think or say or do. As a matter of fact, what other people think about me, it's really not any of my business. And that gets me into acceptance. By surrendering, without knowing what I'm surrendering to, I acknowledge my powerlessness and the mysteries of the universe for which I have no answers. I try not to share too often in meetings about losing my son because I know it makes some people uncomfortable, and I don't want them to feel that way if I can help it. But when I need to share about him, For example, on his death anniversary or his birthday, or when I'm having a particularly sad day. I don't hold back. I make sure I'm surrendered, I keep it short, and I share in a general way. I do this because I feel profoundly and urgently that as parents in recovery who have lost our children and felt the program fail us, we gotta come back to meetings. We have to seek each other out, and we have to share what's happened to us. Here's why. First, because newcomers need our protection. I've heard it said that grief is an outside issue and therefore inappropriate for discussion at a meeting. That's a ridiculous assertion in my view. An outside issue is something that has nothing whatsoever to do with recovery. It has to do with opinions. Everything we suffer is relevant to our journeys to overcome addiction. It's nice when discussion in a meeting is all about gratitude and hope and good feelings, but that's not the way life is sometimes. If we discourage talk of death, grief, and pain, we're acting just like we did when we were drinking. Instead of feeling our feelings, we refuse to confront them head on, hoping they'll go away. Telling people to shut up about their grief is just plain mean. It's the disease talking. If we gather to talk and laugh about how great life is without encouraging sharing about uncomfortable subjects, we're not following the 12-step model anymore. We've become a private club, not a 12-step meeting. More importantly, telling people not to share about grief creates a huge barrier to entry for newcomers. It says to them that there's a list of unwritten rules out there about what they can and can't share, and if they say the wrong thing, we'll jump down their throats and kick them out. So a suffering person either keeps his or her mouth shut or just doesn't come back. We can't let that happen. We also need to come back to meetings to take care of ourselves. We got the recovery we have by working the steps and carrying the message to other alcoholics. We regained our self-respect by acting respectfully. We regained the love of our family and friends by doing the actions a person worthy of love does. We have to go back to meetings after losing our children, even if we feel blamed and judged, to refill our tanks with the power of one alcoholic sharing with another. It's how we become better people, which is the whole point of recovery in the first place. Finally, we have to go back to meetings because if we don't, we won't be there on the day a newly bereaved parent arrives in shattering pain that no one else in the room is going to understand. I'll never forget a meeting I attended about a year or so after Galen died. I was having one of those miserably sad days when it felt like the heartache would never go away. This meeting felt like the last place I wanted to be. Then I heard a young woman share that she had recently given birth to twins, one of whom had died just a few minutes after being born. As she spoke about trying to stay sober through the grief, the postpartum depression, and the round-the-clock demands of her surviving baby, I realized why I was there that day. We talked after the meeting. I shared briefly about my son's death, but mostly I just listened. A dam seemed to break inside her. She told me about watching her tiny baby turn blue and die right before her eyes. How her husband hadn't uttered a single word since and had recently left her, unable to cope. We both cried, and I gave her the name of another sober mom I know who had lost her daughter. I haven't seen her since, but I know now why I was there at that meeting that day. It was to be of service to her. This is why we must share at meetings about our experience, strength, and hope, to show the newcomer that we can walk through anything, even the deaths of our children, without having to drink or deaden our feelings in any way. Because my primary purpose is to stay sober and help others to achieve sobriety, if I can be of service to other parents in recovery who've lost their children, that's what's going to keep me sober today. I want to talk about the promises, The passage I mentioned earlier from the book Alcoholics Anonymous, often referred to as the Big Book. Many of us know this passage almost by heart because it's read at the end of many 12-step meetings, especially in the United States. The passage is a list of the wonderful things that are promised to those who work the steps. For those who aren't familiar with it, here it is, and I quote, "If we are painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. We're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experiences can benefit others. That feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Our whole outlook and attitude upon life will change. Fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. We will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. We will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Are these extravagant promises? We think not. They are being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them." Unquote. For parents in recovery whose sons and daughters have died, these promises can feel terribly empty. Now, I don't blame Bill Wilson, who wrote the Big Book, for framing up the promises the way he did. Remember, before he reimagined the 6 steps of the Oxford group as a solution to alcoholism, there wasn't any treatment for drunks and addicts. They died or went insane, and the medical profession had virtually nothing to offer them except palliative care. Bill's 12-step program changed all that. For the first time, there was a treatment for alcoholism that worked for hundreds, then thousands, then millions of people. That's why the voice of the Big Book is so ebullient and hopeful. Bill had found a way to recover from a terminal, incurable disease. He wrote with the zeal of a death row inmate given not just a last-minute reprieve, but a whole new beautiful life besides. Yet no one knew better than Bill just how cunning, baffling, and powerful the disease of addiction really is. It whispers in my ears, "It's going to be different this time." Even after all these years I've been sober, sometimes on a hot day, I'll get a craving for a cold beer and think, I could have just one. But that's crazy. Who wants just one beer? My wife, who's a normie, would think nothing about leaving a half a glass of wine behind when we leave a restaurant. There ought to be laws against that. Alcoholics like me aren't interested in just one drink. That occasional voice in my head that tells me I could go out and drink like a gentleman, that's my canary in the coal mine. It reminds me who and what I am, and that my disease is out there in the parking lot right now doing push-ups, just waiting for me to let my guard down. Bill positioned the promises as the carrot, with the misery of uncontrollable drinking as the stick, to help us fight that voice. It's why he made the promises so simple and clear. If you do the work, if you take the actions, you'll be happy, serene, peaceful, and free. And if you don't, you won't. No exceptions. No one thought how this would sound to a parent who has just lost a child. The fact is that no one can promise that life won't bring pain or grief. No one can promise that happiness and freedom, serenity and peace are the inevitable result of working the steps every time, all the time. Life just doesn't work that way. There are times, and times I know some of you are going through right now, when you work the steps the best you can, and the pain and grief still go on and on. Telling bereaved parents that if they just do the work, They won't regret the past or wish to shut the door on it, and that they'll comprehend the word serenity and know peace. That's just not helpful. We deeply regret the loss of our children. We're about as far from serenity and peace as we've ever been in our lives. The voice of the big book that brimmed with optimism and hope when we were new, it now sounds chirpy and tone deaf to those of us suffering through the out-of-order deaths of our sons and daughters. The plain fact is that the promises simply don't apply to us right now. But that doesn't mean that the program and the 12 steps will never again be the lifesavers we need and yearn for. Recovery may feel beyond us right now, but its absence doesn't have to be permanent. Not long after the death of our son, I attended a men's stag meeting in Tennessee where I was traveling for my work. I shared about Galen's death and how I felt like I was barely holding on to my sanity. Afterward, an elderly gentleman came up to me and said he had lost his son 40 years earlier, and that not a day went by that he didn't think of him and love him and miss him. He told me I had to just hang tough, that I would never forget my boy, but that things would get easier over time. He told me I'd be okay. We shed a few tears together, then went our separate ways. I will never see that man again, but I will always treasure the gift he gave me that day. The support of a brother in recovery who knew how it felt to suffer the death of a child and who reached out his hand to help a stranger. To parents who are trying to get clean or sober but aren't there yet, I said I'd come back to you at the end of this talk because, again, you're the most important people in the room. If we were together in person today, I'd ask you to stay after and talk to me and other parents in recovery. Get phone numbers, get email addresses, and make contact with us. Those of us who understand completely what you're going through. Because that isn't possible, I ask that you do this. Please get to a meeting. Put your hand up. Make sure that you ask, is there anybody in the room who's lost a child? Share what's happened to you. Share how you're feeling about it. Ask if anybody in the room knows someone who's lost a child, and if so, to talk to you afterwards. I think you'll find, as I did, that there are folks out there in the rooms who are not sharing about the deaths of their children for the same reasons I've talked about today. They will welcome the chance to help you because you're already one of us, a member of our fellowship within a fellowship. You'll be claiming your seat in the rooms that nobody, and I mean nobody, can take away. For those of us already in recovery, we've got to keep an eye out for meetings for newcomers who share about losing a son or daughter. We must give them our numbers, make introductions to other parents whose kids have died, offer to be their sponsors. We've got to create a safe place for them to share about their grief without fear of being blamed or judged for not working the program right. You know, in my experience, the 12-step model works. I owe my life to it. It falls way short for bereaved parents, but that's okay. We can fix it. We can help every bereaved parent struggling to achieve or keep recovery feel accepted and understood as they walk through the darkest days of their lives. We can give the newcomer that one thing that's most elusive after the death of a child, the one thing that will help the most. The gentle assurance, born of shared experience, that someday the pain will ease. As bereaved parents in recovery, and parents who want to be in recovery, we have to put aside the promises for a while. They simply aren't relevant to us right now. We need and deserve a new set of promises designed just for us to guide us in our journeys to achieve and keep recovery after the deaths of our children. So please accept as my gift to you these new promises to parents who have lost kids who are trying to get or stay sober. Here they are. If we share freely about the deaths of our children, if we reject the misguided view that what feels like endless pain is our fault, if we forgive those who withdraw from us, uncomfortable with our grief, then the following will always materialize. We are going to be able someday to talk about our lost children without breaking down. We are going to find ways to honor their memories. We are going to tell their stories to the next generation. We will carry the message of hope to other bereaved parents in recovery. And will come to know that all our beloved children are out there in the universe somewhere, smiling, waiting for us. May the peace and joy of recovery come back to you and remain with you all the days of your lives.